Welcome back, everybody. This is episode 2 of Business Autodidact. My name is Jamel Toms, and at Business Autodidact, what we do here is I'm actually on a self-learning journey called the Personal MBA. The Personal MBA comes from a book by Josh Kaufman, where he outlines 99 business books that you can read, and when you're finished with them, you'll have the equivalent knowledge of an MBA. If you look at my first video, it kind of outlines the reasoning why. But for this episode, we're jumping into our first book of the Personal MBA journey, and that's called Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. So this is the book right here. Try to get this in focus so you all can see that book cover. It's a very beautiful book cover, in my opinion. So the format that we're going to be doing on the Business Autodidact, for each book, I'm going to break it into fourths. I'm going to be reading a quarter of the book each week and bringing you a video each week that covers the previous quarter. Being an engineer, I thought it was interesting if I did the math, and 99 books into fourths, every week, it's going to take over 7.5 years to get through 99 books. Man, I'll be an old man by then, but it'll be worth it to go through this journey and share what I'm learning with you all. And hopefully you all can take away something from it too. I'm going to jump in with the whiteboard so that you can have some visuals as we review this chapter. There's quite a bit of content that I was able to outline when coming up with this video. I'm not entirely sure how long I'm going to keep these videos. I was ballparking that they would take about 10 minutes each video, but I think it could end up taking 20 minutes. Bear with me as I'm learning with this journey of building this YouTube channel and delivering compelling content that you guys can learn from as we go through here. So there may be some changes and things that I'm learning on the fly, but I figure it's better just to get the material out so that you all can learn and also I can learn in the process. Okay, guys, let's get ready to dive into the book. This is my first time doing this, so there may be some growing pains and things may get a little jittery, but I'm going to work my way best as I can through the book. I have my whiteboard up. I have my Kindle up so we can review the notes together and kind of just work our way through this first quarter of the book where I can speak to it freely and share my insights and what I'm thinking about everything. All right, so let's kick it off with the quote that Donella first decided to start the book with. Managers are not confronted with problems that are independent of each other, but with dynamic situations that consist of complex systems of changing problems that interact with each other. I call such situations messes. Managers do not solve problems because they manage messes. All right, so I highlighted this one because this resonates with me. Many times, especially now that I'm more in a leadership position coming from a strong background as an engineer, I see a lot of things that emerge and things that are not so pretty, situations that tend to devolve. And a lot of these things you do not have complete control over. And so you have to understand that these things are parts of a bigger system. And until you start to really look at these things with a systems perspective, you won't be able to adequately address them, because if you can adjust the system, the way things work, you can get the results that you want. All right. So we're going to look through some of these things. And you'll see here, we got this next highlight. Once we see the relationship between structure and behavior, we can begin to understand how systems work, what makes them produce poor results, and how to shift them into better behavior patterns. And this kind of highlights what I was just speaking about. And this is how you can see that the idea and the patterns of thinking are in alignment. It's a way of thinking that gives us the freedom to identify root causes of problems and see new opportunities. And so here, Donella is going to share with us what is a system, at least at a high level, bird's eye view. And so we can see here that a system is a set of things And she describes these as potentially examples, people, cells, molecules, or whatever, interconnected in such a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior over time. And this is a quote that I really like. The system, to a large extent, causes its own behavior. An outside event may unleash that behavior, but the same outside event applied to a different system is likely to produce a different result. And this is you want to look at this from a business perspective, especially with COVID is a good example. COVID was the same outside event that had an effect on every business. Some businesses crumbled when this happened. Some of them went into disarray, and some of them survived and thrived. And this speaks to the testament that depending on the structure of the system, and how the system can endure or respond to it in totally different ways. All right, so let's go to the next page. And so when I'm thinking about systems, I'm thinking about how they're such a major piece to pretty much everything. And one of the things I like to look at is the human body. I think about our circulatory system, our respiratory system, our digestive system, our nervous system, our skeletal system, our reproductive system. You have all these systems that overlap each other, overlay each other, and they all work together in concert to bring life to you. And they survive and thrive and grow, and they maintain themselves. They fight off diseases for the life expectancy of a normal human. And this is quite incredible. And you can see here, Donella also kind of highlights this here where she says, we are a complex system. Our own bodies are magnificent examples of integrated, interconnected, self-maintaining complexity. All right. And so a few other things that stood out to me is this one here, where she talks about delays in complex systems. So this is something that's going to come back that's really important to understand. When we're working through math problems and those sort of things, you tend to have like a result, an instantaneous result of what is this thing resolved to at this moment. The thing about systems is because they have to evolve and they function over a period of time, there's this concept of feedback delays where information or signals that come back into the system happen at a later point, which can only influence the future. Let's go to the next one. So this one right here, I think is important. A diverse system with multiple pathways and redundancies is more stable and less vulnerable to external shock than a uniform system with little diversity. We see this in business with investing in the concept of diversification. Diversification is a way of shoring up your business. And this is why some companies that only have one lane, they can be viewed as a little risky, but sometimes depending on the strength of that lane can rule out or mitigate some of those concerns. But in general, if you want something that's going to be stable and strong and resilient, you need to have multiple pathways and redundancies built into your system. And you can see that even with the human body. And I think about this sometimes. We have two hands, we have two eyes, we have two ears, we have two nostrils. And so even in the composition of the human body, this concept of redundancy is at play. So just so you guys are aware, the yellow things are kind of things that I just think are interesting facts that I want to note. And then the red are things that I think are crucial, critical points from my perspective. And the blue represents things that can be somewhat interesting. All right. So this is an interesting point here is this whole concept of Western understanding and analytical viewpoint. So ever since the Industrial Revolution, Western society has benefited from science, logic, and reductionism over intuition and holism. All right. So this is something that I think everyone needs to really take a time to expand. I know if you're an engineer, you're a mathematician, and you don't take times to kind of explore some of the social sciences and philosophy, you may tend to have a bias towards scientific fact and not understanding the unification and the singularity of many things and phenomena in life and how they all are interconnected and they impact each other and influence each other. So holism is that word that stands out here to me. And so it'll come up a little bit later here, but I'll dive to that more. But typically with your business and any system that you're trying to improve, massage, morph, adjust, make adjustments to fine tune, it's very important that when you fix an instance of a problem, right, that you're not creating more problems. And what often that entails is that you have to take time to really identify the root cause so that you can adjust that, right? And then you will have the greatest probability of avoiding introducing new problems into the system. All right. And so let's take a look at this red block. It's almost irresistible to blame something or someone else to shift responsibility away from ourselves and to look for the control knob, the product, the pill, the technical fix that will make a problem go away. And if you come down here a little bit further, you'll see I said no one deliberately creates these problems. No one wants them to persist, but they persist nonetheless. That is because they are intrinsically systems problems, undesirable behaviors, characteristic of the system structures that produce them. So what they're kind of here, and I thought this was important because sometimes when you're in your business, and this can happen to any aspect of your business, and so you kind of have to think about applying these principles to many different applications. But a lot of times when a problem arises, no one person is necessarily responsible for them, right? And it's so easy to try to point to someone, to blame someone and say that's the problem, right? And it is very well possible that the system itself is producing this problem. So if you were to move the person or the thing that you believe is causing that problem, you could just be gearing up for the next replacement to run into the same problem because that is not the source of the issue. And this blue block is really interesting to me. It says obvious yet submersive, an old way of seeing yet somehow new, comforting in that the solutions are in our hands, disturbing because we must do things or at least see things and think about things in a different way. This was important to me because I thought it reflected the depth that Donella is really thinking when she's looking at these problems, because what she's saying is that there are some problems that are malignant that we can't seem to make go away. And you may feel helpless. Oh, that's just the way it's going to be. But once you pull back that veil and you can understand the system behind it, and even the awareness that there could be a system behind it, now there's a new level of responsibility as a business owners that we must have to do things. We may have to figure out things. We have to learn things and how to undo them and fix them. So there's a new level of responsibility and accountability once you get this knowledge. Another key point here, very important. Donella, the author, she makes very liberal use of diagrams in the book. And because she says there's a problem with discussing systems and words. And they all, when you're dealing with a system, it all happens simultaneously, just like in your business, right? Your sales are happening simultaneously as your production, your recruiting efforts are happening simultaneously, your performance evaluation systems are happening simultaneously. All of these different things in your business are happening at once. Accounts receivable, accounts payable, acquisitions. And so all of these things are happening once and over time at once. And so having a way to kind of visualize these things at once and put that into your mind is very important, and trying to put these in words. And you'll see this in this book where there'll be a graphic and it's so small and it conveys so much meaning. And then Donella will describe the graphic and it takes paragraphs and so many words just to describe what you're seeing. So we'll see that a little bit later. With systems, right? Systems have a capacity, a load. And this quote here, and why you can be doing something that has always worked and suddenly discover to your great disappointment that your action no longer works, and why a system might suddenly and without warning jump into a kind of behavior you've never seen before. This happens, and you'll see this, especially if you're in a startup or you're working and you're seeing something grow, you're working on a project and it goes from being something small to big. And it could happen in other situations, right? I don't want to pretend that I'm enumerating all the instances where you'll observe this phenomena, but What I'm saying is that if you have something small and you may have an established system of doing things, right? And you may reach an inflection point or a breaking point, what they call it, the critical mass or something like that. But it's that point where things go from having worked fine to now that just suddenly it's not working anymore and things begin to get worse. And you'll see that with systems, and these systems theory where you'll begin to figure out why is that the case, and understanding what is undergirding that and how you can actually get these systems back on track. And this was a really interesting point here. I probably should have highlighted this whole thing because it's a good point, and we want to get here. When our small research group moved from MIT to Dartmouth College years ago, one of the Dartmouth engineering professors watched us in seminars for a while and then dropped by our offices. Says, "You people are different. You ask different kinds of questions. You see things I don't see. Somehow you come at the world in a different way. How and why?" And then listen, that's what I hope to get across throughout this book, but especially in its conclusion. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about, holism. I don't think the system's way of seeing is better than reductionist way of thinking. I think it's complementary and therefore revealing. And so that complementary aspect brings it back whole. It was unwhole if you're just looking at a reduction or resistance, but you have to be able to see the micro and the macro to really get a fully understanding of everything. And it's interesting how you can see the words are aligning here. I said macro and micro. So she says microscope. And a telescope is dialing outward. So just understanding that is very important. Let's go ahead to the next page. Here's a very important point. The behavior of a system cannot be known just by knowing the elements of which the system is made. And so this is critical because we're going to start to really dive into what is a system and all. So we understand the criteria and to what it is to make a system. And so once you know what those things are, you'll be able to quickly determine some systems. So systems are not just elements, and we're going to get to that in part 1. All right, so here, really important, a system is an interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something. If you look at the definition closely for a minute, you can see that a system must consist of 3 kinds of things: elements, interconnections, and a function or purpose. And so these things, I like to visualize these things as this way. Let's kind of pull up this whiteboard. So if you're thinking about a system, right? Right, and then you have the interconnections. Right. And then, right. And so, and then this is the function or purpose, right? And just kind of draw this, kind of got this Earth's crust and core thing going on. So the reason why I draw this like this is because the thing so starting from the inside has the least influence over the system, right? So the elements of the system have the least, when I say influence, they have the least impact on how the system will function. And then you have the interconnections, the relationships, the rules of the system. These have a more profound effect over how that system behaves and functions. And at the very core, the function or purpose of the system has the most profound guiding principle of how that system is going to behave and what happens in that system. Now, on the flip side, right? So I'm going to put this little axis most influence. And then here, coming inward, you have the most visible. And so this thing is this system all of the things that comprise it, that makes it qualify as a system, all of these things are not apparent. And so starting from the insides, the elements are the most apparent and obvious things to identify, the interconnections, thinking like a football team, the rules of the game, right? And the function or the purpose of it is sometimes the least obvious, I should say, thing to detect, right? And sometimes the stated function or purpose is not the actual function or purpose. You have to look at the outcomes and what the behavior of a system is to truly determine its function or purpose. So let's get back to the book. I think that visual helps kind of spell out some of the dialogue in here. All right. And so for example, in the digestive system, Donella talks about teeth, enzymes, stomach, and intestines, and how those are elements of your digestive systems. And then the interrelation is the physical flow of food through an elegant set of regulating chemical signals. And the function of this system is to break down food into its basic nutrients and to transfer those nutrients into the bloodstream while discarding unusable waste. So this is a great example of a system. Talk about football team here. You have a school, which is a system. A tree is a system. The earth is a system. And so now you can see this interrelationship of interwoven systems, the systems of systems. All right. And this is another interesting. When a living creature dies, it loses its systemness. The multiple interrelations that held it together no longer function, and it dissipates, although its material remains part of a larger food web system. So even the death of a system could be a functioning element of a higher order system. All right. So here we go. A system is more than a sum of its parts. It may exhibit adaptive, dynamic, goal-seeking, self-preserving, and sometimes evolutionary behavior. That's a gem right there. Let me read it again. A system is more than the sum of its parts. It may exhibit adaptive, dynamic, goal-seeking, self-preserving, and sometimes evolutionary behavior. And this is interesting, right? Systems adapt. When things get hectic, when things get unusual, they adapt to try to stay there, right? And this is in the system of bodies, we have this called homeostasis, right? They're dynamic. They have a degree of being able to change a little bit, to morph, to dodge, and goal seeking. They have objectives that they want to fulfill. And then they're self-preserving. They want to stay alive. They want to live for another day. And then they're evolutionary. The things, they can produce other things. They can even create other systems. And this is what we want to see in business. You can see this where business starts off one way, right? You can look at Intuit starting out doing accounting, and then you start seeing them acquire these other businesses and really expanding and getting into that principle of diversity and multiple pathways that we spoke about earlier. All right. She kind of delves into this, what I did. You can see from these examples that there's an integrity or wholeness about a system and an active set of mechanisms to maintain that integrity. Systems can change, adapt, and even respond to events, seek goals, mend injuries, and attend to their own survival in lifelike ways. Although they may contain or consist of non-living things, systems can be self-organizing and often are self-repairing over at least some range of disruptions. They are resilient, and many of them are evolutionary. Out of one system, other completely new systems, never before imagined systems can arise. Forgive me for adding a few things in there, but I think the meaning stayed the same. And so here, we talked about this briefly. I'll hit these points. The elements of a system are often the easiest parts to notice. And here, I thought this was very important that you have to understand that not all elements in the systems are tangible. Intangibles are also elements of a system. And for a great example, in a university, school pride and academic prowess are two intangibles. And then the next thing, before you go into far, it's a good idea to stop dissecting out them and start to look for interconnections, the relationships that hold elements together. And this is a great checklist here. How to know whether you're looking at a system or just a bunch of stuff. Can you identify the parts? Do the parts affect each other? Do the parts together produce an effect that is different from the effect of each part on its own? And does the effect, this behavior over time, persist in a variety of circumstances? All right, so let's go ahead to the next page. Many of the interconnections in systems operate through the flow of information. Information holds systems together and plays a great role in determining how they operate. Information flow and its criticality to systems. This is a very interesting point. I was reading Ray Dalio's Principles book years ago. I didn't finish reading the whole book, but I remember getting to a point in the book where he was talking about how he was setting up his investment firm or whatever, and how one of his principles was openness of information. Almost everything in the company was free for anyone in the company to consume. It was no secrets, essentially. And this radical approach to information sharing, from his perspective, empowered the company, right? And we all been in organizations where it seems like information is stuck and it doesn't flow. It doesn't get to the right people at the right time. And as a whole, the system, the organization itself suffers. It's inefficient, it's slow, it's heavy, and it cannot respond to challenges and opportunities effectively. So this is something I just wanted to highlight, that information is really important. And this is why you'll see entire fields dedicated to information, right? You got information, knowledge management, information technology, information architecture, all these different things, ways of preserving and sharing information, right? So this is a really interesting point of systems. And you can see here, many interconnections are flows of information, signals that go to decision points or action points within a system. And if you ever did any business process management or business process design, you'll see that information flow is key to making that whole workflow complete and move through effectively. So that's another key point. And so here we go. If information-based relationships are hard to see, functions or purposes are even harder. A system's function or purpose is not necessarily spoken, written, or expressed explicitly except through the operation of the system. The best way to deduce the system purpose is to watch for a while to see how the system behaves. And you come down here, purposes are deduced from behavior, not from rhetoric or stated goals. And this is important because although we're talking about business, there are other systems at play, political systems, belief systems, religious systems, and sometimes their stated goals and their rhetoric is totally out of line of what those systems actually produce. And so this is a way to kind of cut through the BS, if you will, and really get to the hard meat of what a system is really. Forget that point right there. Try to speed up a little bit. I don't want to drag this thing out, but this book is really packed with some great information. All right. So the word function is generally used for non-human system, the word purpose for a human one, but the distinction is not absolute, since so many systems have both human and non-human elements. An important function of almost every system is to ensure its own perpetuation. I like that one right there because when you're building your business, you want it to stay alive and perpetuate. When you think about the major corporations like JP Morgan and some of these other ones that have been around for a long time, like Ford, you really want these things to last as long as possible so that you can extract the most value out of them. In fact, one of the most frustrating aspects of systems is that the purposes of subunits may not add up to an overall behavior that anyone wants. And so here she talks about, be honest with you, I'm not sure why rampant drug addiction and crime is something that comes up a lot in this book, but it seems to fascinate her. And she talks about how all these different subsystems at play lead to these kind of unexpected outcomes. And so the one here is drug addiction and crime. And she kind of says there's desperate people who want quick relief of psychological pain. People want to make money. You got pushers who are not, bound by civil law, police that oppose them, governments that make this stuff illegal, wealthy people and poor people living close together, and non-addicts who really are just more interested in protecting themselves versus trying to encouraging the recovery of addicts. But that's just something that came up. I guess it's mildly interesting. Systems can be nested within systems. Therefore, there can be purposes within purposes. And this is interesting because as an architect of a business, you have to be aware of these things and how these subsystems They all have their own sub-purposes, and you have to orchestrate these things so they function harmoniously and they lead to the result that you want. So keeping sub-purposes and overall system purposes in harmony is an essential function of successful systems. So she goes ahead and says it right there. Kind of goes back to the graphic I showed you guys not too long ago, and how the most influential over this system is the function. Then you come down to the interconnections, and then finally the elements. And so she's just breaking this out in word form. So I'm going to skip over that. All right, so here we're going to go. We're starting to get into the good stuff, in my opinion, is how do you really kind of depict these systems and really break down how they work. And so she starts this off with this thing called a stock, right? The stock is the foundation of any system. Stocks are the elements of the system that you can see, feel, count, or measure at any given time. A system stock is just what it sounds like: a store, a quantity, accumulation of material, or information that is built up over time. It may be the water in the bathtub, a population, the books in a bookstore, the wood in the tree, money in the bank, your own self-confidence. A stock does not have to be physical. Your reserve of goodwill towards others, or your supply of hope that the world can be better, are both stocks. So a stock is the memory of the history of changing flows within a system. So this is right here is key. So I'm going to say it again. A stock is the memory of the history of changing flows within the system. All right. So we got that key aspect of stock. And next is the flow. Stocks change over time through the action of flows. Flows are filling and draining, births and deaths, purchases and sales, growth and decay, deposits and withdrawals, successes and failures. A stock, then, is the present memory of the history of changing flows within a system. And so here you see a few drawings of these different diagrams of the stock that flows. And so you see here, and this is how she kind of draws it in this book. You see the square is the stock, and then you see these arrows as inflows and outflows into the stock. And then you see this little, I guess you call it spigot or nozzle right here, because this kind of shows that you can turn it up or down. So you can turn the inflow up, or you can turn it down. You can turn the outflow up or down. All right. And so here you have this diagram where there's no inflow. And this is a nice way to depict this, because she's saying that the inflow here is effectively non-existent when you're looking at the same time scale, because she's saying that these mineral deposits take eons to build up. So that doesn't happen on the same time frame as mining, right? So you could just eliminate it from. So here you can see water in the reservoir. So you can see multiple inflows and multiple outflows from the same stock. Got the water in the reservoir, you got rain, you got river inflow coming in, and going out, you got evaporation and discharge. All right. And this is a pretty interesting example here. We got, we have, I guess, some kind of logging industry going on here. We have the forest, wood and living trees. So you got tree growth, increasing the stock here. You have trees dying, which are decreasing the stock, and you have loggers, right? They're logging and they're taking the wood out of the forest, which is affecting the stock, which goes into the lumber inventory, which is another stock in lumber sales. So you can see these system of systems at play, right? And you can kind of look at these in isolation and study them, and then you could put them together, right? And so the way you describe the relationship, so the way you can describe the relationship between the inflows, outflows, and stock, it's called dynamics, all right? So the dynamics of stock and flows, their behavior over time. Key thing here is system thinkers use graphs of system behavior to understand trends over times rather than focusing attention on individual events. We also use behavior over time graphs to learn whether the system is approaching a goal or a limit, and if so, how quickly. And so here you got a couple graphs here. One graph is depicting the inflows, right, and the outflows. So you got gallons per minute on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And here you can actually see the stock, right? And so you're looking at the stock of the tub over time based on these changing inflows and outflows. And there you have it. You can see the picture right there. And so Whenever the inflow and outflows are effectively equivalent, you have a state of dynamic equilibrium. That's basically where the stock doesn't change. So these are just interesting points that we want to take time to account for. One of the things that was interesting here, actually, let me go over these bullet points here. I'm just going to read them out aloud to you guys. Switch to this view so I can switch it up a little bit. So, this is going to sound kind of self-explanatory, but as long as the sum of all inflows exceeds the sum of all outflows, the level of the stock will rise. As long as the sum of all outflows exceeds the sum of all inflows, the level of the stock will fall. If the sum of all outflows equals the sum of all inflows, the stock will not change. It will be held in dynamic equilibrium at whatever level it happened to be when the two sets of flows became equal. So here's another interesting point that Donella brings up. I thought this was pretty interesting. The human mind seems to focus more easily on times and systems than on flows. On top of that, when we do focus on flows, we tend to focus on inflows more easily than outflows. Therefore, we sometimes miss seeing that we can fill a bathtub not only by increasing the inflow rate, but by also decreasing the outflow rate, right? So you think about this. If you're thinking, I think a quick example is building wealth, right? Most people say, if I can make more money, right? But everyone knows in personal finance, they also is about how much money you keep, right? So turning down that outflow, you can actually become wealthy versus well as just, turning up that inflow. So always remember that there's a few ways to increase stock, right? So, and here she kind of spells it out down here. It's not on the screen, but I'll just read it for you. Stock can be increased by decreasing its outflow rate as well as by increasing its inflow rate. And this is something that's also important. Similarly, a company can build up a larger workforce by more hiring, or it can do the same thing by reducing the rates of quitting and firing. Right? And another thing is stock takes time to change because flows take time to flow. And they can act as delays, lags, buffers, ballasts, and sources of momentum in a system. And so stocks generally, and this is a quote from her book, stocks generally change slowly, even when the flows into or out of them change suddenly. Therefore, stocks act as delays or buffers or shock absorbers in systems. And so this is a good thing, right? And the fact that it takes time for the stocks to change because they're responding to flows, it's kind of inherent in why they exist and why they're so powerful. That time that it takes to change gives the opportunity for correction. And so that's something to think about in your business, is that if you're always analyzing the system and what is producing, and you don't like what is producing, i.e. the stocks, the levels aren't where you want them to be, think about how you can adjust the inflows and outflows. And then you have to even enumerate the inflows and outflows. And that's how you're going to unlock that power. There was one major point that I didn't really go into that I did want to kind of dive into, is that because systems, they take on a life of their own, it's almost like a higher order creation. And so when you create a system or you give birth to a system, you're almost giving birth to an entity that takes on its own form, and it can develop and evolve over time. And you see this with all types of things. Just think about even things like ideas that actually get put into practice, that they just never go away. They evolve and they take on their own form. And so this is a very high level thing that we're talking about. And it kind of bridges over into the metaphysical world to some extent. And that's kind of what I wanted to highlight here for some of those folks that are into that sort of thing, is that systems operate at a metaphysical level. And when you create systems, you're giving birth to metaphysical. And when you shape systems, you're shaping the metaphysical. So this is real high level stuff here. But that's one of the things about business. Businesses are going to constantly challenge you to expand your mind, to expand your understanding of things, and really take all these different bodies of knowledge and really synthesizing those things and translating those things into things that cause real change in drivers in business. All right, here we go. And here we go. She says it here. I'm going to switch to this back to the book so you can see a little bit of it. So the time lags imposed by stocks allow room to maneuver, to experiment, and to revise policies that aren't working. All right. And also another thing here is that I thought this was interesting. If you have a sense of the rates of change of stocks, you don't expect things to happen faster than they can happen. You don't give up too soon. You can use the opportunities presented by a system's momentum to guide it toward a good outcome. Now, I like this one here is because you don't expect things to happen faster than they can. And sometimes this is good to know because some people want things to happen instantly and you can't, it's not possible. I guess the thing that makes you feel better about it is that it gives you hope that you can actually make things happen eventually. All right. And so I really like this when stocks allow inflows and outflows to be decoupled and to be independent and temporarily out of balance with each other, right? So if we get the controverse, if we were doing mathematics or discrete math, all right, you could say you can decouple inflows and outflows by introducing stocks, right? So the mere existence of a stock basically commands that there is a separate inflow and outflow. And so whenever you're dealing with something that you can't respond to in time, or you need some sort of delay or quote unquote shock absorber, you create a stock, right? And so here, Donella just goes and says it outright. Human beings have invented hundreds of stock maintaining mechanisms to make inflows and outflows independent and stable. All right, we see this in electronics with things like capacitors and resistors, right? And they even have a class, because I'm a computer engineer and we had to take a few electrical engineering courses. They even have a class called signals and systems, right? And it kind of just dovetails nicely into this. And one of the things that as a business owner that you'll need to understand is you'll get there if you get big enough and or if you're already that big or you're in a big business and you're starting to recognize these phenomena, is that accounts receivable, accounts payable, you sending out your invoices and you're expecting payment in the days till you get your payment. That lag can really have an impact on the operations of your business. And so you have to actually go out there, and as CFOs and treasurers, they'll understand that, hey, they need to go out and figure out, how do I get some sort of financial instrument that can basically buffer and absorb the shock and delays within these two systems coming together. All right. So that's something that is an invention, a technology that you must take advantage of when you're in business. All right. Because that allows you to grow and grow stably and resiliently. Okay. And she kind of states it right here. Banks enable you temporarily to earn money at a different rate from how you spend, and vice versa. All right. So let's go to the next page. All right. And so how the system runs itself, feedback. And let me not skip this. Systems thinkers see the world as a collection of stocks, along with the mechanisms for regulating the levels in the stocks by manipulating flows. All right. And so here, what we're going to dive into next is, I don't want to spend too much more time on this, is Donna's going to start talking about different types of feedback loops and how they will affect systems, right? We're talking about some basic feedback here. And in this case, she calls this the stabilizing loop, the balancing feedback loop. And that's why she has a B right here, right? And so she has this example of someone kind of having the stock of stored energy in the body, and there's a stock of energy available for work. And then the feedback is your desired. And so that's one of the things. The feedback can be perceptions, right? So there can be a number of things. And as we go through this, you'll start to recognize things. So your desired energy levels of feedback. And then you take these multiple feedback points and they can lead to other feedbacks, right? So the feedback can be functions of functions. I don't want to get too mathematical, but your desired energy levels are input into this function. The energy, perceived energy level can go into this function, and then the discrepancy goes into this, and then you can see how it adjusts the input, metabolic energy. So just understanding that, hey, man, I'm not feeling like I have enough energy. So I'm going to drink some more coffee. That boosts my energy. Now I'm like, okay, I'm at my desired energy level. I feel like I have too much energy. So you may not drink as much coffee. So, and then you can see your energy expenditure, right? You may also decide that you want to, rest or not work as hard. And so that could be a feedback loop going into the energy expenditure. All right, so let's read this definition here just for the record. A feedback loop is a closed chain of causal connections from a stock through a set of decisions or rules or physical laws or actions that are dependent on the level of the stock and back again through a flow to change the stock. Okay, that's a bucket of words, but let's just say that something happens. You respond to what happened. That information goes back to determine how you will future respond to that action. All right. Okay. This kind of stabilizing, goal-seeking, regulating loop is called a balancing feedback loop. As you can see here, this is kind of this chart. I always like to look at the nature of a curve right here. And you can see this kind of, what is this? A polynomial effect, right? Where this thing is kind of just gradually tapering off. And so it looks like it's approaching some limit. And so that's that limit or that goal seeking here that you're going to see in these feedback loops. So balancing feedback loops are equilibrating or goal seeking structures and systems, both sources of stability and sources of resistance to change. And so this is a key point, the resistance to change, because stability also can be a good thing, but sometimes that there's some people that you work with or people that you're around that they want to stay the same so much that actually are resistant to change. So if you are in a company that's trying to grow and do big things, you actually need to remove the barriers. You need to actually unlock these barriers, these stability controlling mechanisms. So the presence of a feedback mechanism doesn't necessarily mean that the mechanism works well. The feedback mechanism may not be strong enough to bring the stock to the desired level. Feedbacks, the interconnections, the information part of the system can fail for many reasons. Information can arrive too late or at the wrong place. It can be unclear or incomplete or hard to interpret. The action it triggers may be too weak or delayed or resource constrained or simply ineffective. All right, so this is a key point. Now, anyone that I break this down, okay? And so what I mean here is as a leader, business owner, or business person, you're going to be interacting with many systems. And these charts, they make it appear that the feedback is like a Rosetta Stone or something that tells you exactly what to do in response to the system. No, so feedback can be anything, right? It could be that, I don't know, let's see here that there is more potholes on the road or something, right? That's a form of feedback. Obvious thing is that we need to, repave the roads. Maybe we need to seal things better. But what I'm trying to say here is that sometimes the feedback itself needs to be decoded and analyzed against the backdrop of the system to see, okay, what is this feedback telling me? What is producing this feedback? What is the stock that is affected by this feedback? Because in many times, these system problems, they start off as little tiny cracks. And you'll see this with this other type of loop. This feedback loop is the reinforcing. Start off as little cracks, and they begin to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they compound exponentially. And so, sometimes, as she put it, it can be too late, or the adjustments that you're making may not be strong enough. Maybe the adjustments are too minor to really resolve the system's issue. And so do not be lulled into a sense that just because you have feedback and you responded, that you're making the appropriate response to that feedback, that you're adjusting the inflows and outflows properly. So just make sure you pay attention to that. Runaway loops, reinforcing feedback. So reinforcing feedback is kind of what we're talking about. And this is that whole kind of exponential influence into a system, right? And so the most common one that most people are familiar with are going to be, I'm trying to get my mouse here. One of the most common ones that we're going to be, that most people are going to be familiar with is going to be the bank account, right? And so put your money in the bank, you earn interest, that interest goes back into the bank account, increases the stock or the balance of the bank account, and then you get more interest. And over time, as you all know, is that thing is an exponential curve. And if you put enough years behind it, that you will see exponential growth, even if it's very subtle in the beginning. Reinforcing feedback loops are self-enhancing, leading to exponential growth or runaway collapses over time. All right. And so just because you start off with the example of the bank account, just kind of shooting up, right? They can also go in the other direction where they can shoot down, as you can see with debt, right? It's the same kind of thing. All right. And so let's kind of go ahead to the next few examples here. And so we're getting close to finishing the first quarter of this book. This is a lot of information to process, I know. So I'm going to speed through the final section of this. And so what we have here is we're starting to look at things from more than one types of loops affecting a single stock, right? So we're going to look at some one stock systems with multiple feedback loops and seeing how those things play together. So let's start this off with this quote from Albert Einstein. The goal of all theory is to make the basic elements as simple and as few as possible without having to surrender the adequate representation of experience. So it's very systems way of looking at things, is because you're kind of removing like the details about how these things work. And you're looking at the structure and how these things relate and how the inflows and outflows affect the stock. So you're really looking at these things from a total different lens. And you can really start seeing things that have nothing to do with each other and how they're so dissimilar, but because the structure and the interrelations are similar, that you see the same behavior. And so that's the power of systems thinking. So this is a really good example here. Two competing balancing loops, right? And so you're thinking about your home and you're trying to cool it down or warm it up. And in this example, it must be cold outside because you have heat from the furnace increasing the room temperature, right? So the room temperature is the stock and it's cold outside. So the heat is escaping to the outside, through the windows, through the doors, through the roof. And so you have this balancing loop on the inflow, where you set this thermostat and it's trying to maintain a certain room temperature. And whenever the room temperature is different from the thermostat, it's going to turn on that furnace. And once it reaches it, it turns it off. So the heat from the cold outside is causing the heat to dissipate and it's slowly pulling the temperature down. And so these two balancing loops are working, pushing and pulling each other. And this is how the feedback loop works. All right, so let's jump to the next page. And you can see here, set the thermostat, the room temperature goes up. And then if you look at the other balancing feedback loop, you see the outside temperature, right? And this is pulling the temperature down. And when you layer these things, it's kind of like that whole superposition principle. You'll see that the room temperature never quite hits the thermostat setting, but it stays relatively constant. And here, and this is why you'll see sometimes if you want that temperature exactly what you want, you'll overcorrect it, right? And that's a key term here. The information delivered by a feedback loop, even non-physical feedback, can only affect future behavior. It can't deliver a signal fast enough to correct behavior that drove the current feedback. So this is another thing, right? So when things go wrong, and I'm kind of jumping, let me slow down here. So because this is telling you that the feedback can only affect future behavior and not the thing that already happened, that's how you have to think about problem solving. And this is a good point, in my opinion, because many times when something goes wrong in business, the first thing you want to do is you want to go point and say this, and that's the reason, right? Whatever could be the reason. But the reality here is what this is telling you is that the first time something happens, you're not going to be able to catch it or solve for it until you get the feedback, right? You get the feedback and then you correct it. So don't beat yourselves up when things start to go off the rails, but you do hold yourself accountable and begin to make systemic changes to fix those problems. All right. And so here I put this in red and it says, well, why is this important? Because it means there will always be delays in responding. Okay. And this is something that we have to be able to communicate to others that work with us and understand that, hey, we've identified an issue. Let's develop a plan and let's resolve it. Okay. All right. Next step. Oh, here we go. Another thing that really applies to enterprise software. If you're gearing up your workforce to a higher level, you have to hire fast enough to correct for those who quit while you were hiring. And so here we're looking at a thermostat and it's identical to recruiting for a business, right? So you got your recruiting efforts and your hiring efforts, and that's the inflow in the system. That's the furnace warming the room up or growing the company. And then you would just have this phenomenon that just happens, right? There's always going to be a certain number of people, which they call the attrition rate, just that outside temperature, that there's going to be a natural amount of people who are going to leave, find other opportunities, move away, or some people, they got let go because for whatever reason. All right. And you have this kind of thing where you got this balancing loop. And so here, a stock maintaining balancing feedback loop must have its goals set appropriately to compensate for draining or inflowing processes that affect that stock. Otherwise, the feedback process will fall short of or exceed the target for the stock. All right. And so here we can see where sometimes these balancing loops can break down and the system doesn't, the room temperature in this case, or the goal of this system is not being really met adequately. And so here you can see it's just so cold outside that the heater can't even keep the room warm. And so from this period here at the 12-hour, you can see that the temperature is just dropping, right? But I guess as the sun comes out and things get warm a little bit, and then they can warm the room back up. All right. So this is interesting. And so what this is going to kind of shift us into is this whole concept of shifting dominance. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but when you have these different feedback loops in a system, right, they could be more than just two. We're kind of looking at things in isolation to develop an understanding so that we can begin to overlay that understanding and get a sense of how these things can work when maybe you have 12 or 15 feedback loops. And that's where that specific knowledge kicks in that you can develop in your industry of how things are really functioning at play. And that shifting dominance theory is going to come into play there. And so here, this is another type of class of loops in this kind of whatever you call this system zoo. I'm not a big fan of the zoo analogy, but it is what it is. And so here we have a reinforcing loop with a balancing loop. And so here we're talking about population. All right. And so you have your inflow births, which is a reinforcing loop because the more people there are, the more people that they can give birth to, so on and so forth. All right. Now the deaths is a balancing loop. And for some reason, just being a math guy for all my life, I'm thinking about exponential function and linear function, right? And how those things come together. And so the deaths, in my opinion, is more of like a linear function, right? So people are passing, and that's that mortality rate, right? That's people are dying at a certain amount. Now, if the deaths pick up too much, right, then that's going to really impact the number of births, right? And so there's less people to give birth to more people. So you'll see that the population will decline as being the stock. And so you'll see a different graph. So here on the top graph here, you'll see the births are much greater than the deaths. You'll see the population slowly grow exponentially. And if there's too many deaths or if there's a war, famine, or whatever, you'll see that the population, the stock will decline, right? And so what you can see here is if the births and deaths are at a certain number where they balance each other out, you'll hit this state of dynamic equilibrium with the population to be the same. And so this behavior is an example of shifting dominance of feedback loops. Dominance is an important concept in systems thinking. When one loop dominates another, it has a stronger impact on behavior because systems often have several competing feedback loops operating simultaneously. Those loops that dominate the system would determine the behavior. And that's a gem right there. So if you can identify the dominant loops or feedback loop in the system, you can determine what the behavior or what the outcomes will be. All right. So let's read this next quote from Donella. Complex behaviors of systems often arise as the relative strengths of feedback loop shift, causing first one loop and then another to dominate behavior. All right. So now, this is something I do want to highlight here. I'm going to read these questions here from Donella. These are very critical and I think are really important to business strategic thinking, right? And so I'm just going to read it out verbatim. Whenever you're confronted with a scenario, there are questions you need to ask that will help you decide how good a representation of reality is the underlying model. Are the driving factors likely to unfold this way? If they did, would the system react this way? What is driving the driving factors? When you're looking at a systems problem in your business, you have to begin to conceptualize what is causing things to happen the way they are, right? And then what are the scenarios that we can use to adjust this thing, right? And if the system, and if these things did potentially happen, would the system react this way? And then additionally, on top of that, what is driving these driving factors, okay? And a systems analysis can test a number of scenarios to see what happens if the driving factors do different things. That's usually one purpose of a systems analysis. But you have to be the judge of which scenario, if any, should be taken seriously as a future that might really be possible, right? And so that's right there that's the nugget there, right? The systems thinking approach to scenario analysis or system analysis, and using that to predict what can happen. All right, so let's get ready to wrap this up. Here, let's pivot to this example. I think this is really important. So we just looked at births and deaths and population as a stock. So this is the same type of loop. You've got one reinforcing loop and you have one balancing loop on the outflow. Your stock is your capital. Think of these about capital investments, equipment, dollars invested in some company, startup, angel investing, right? But I think this is mostly, in a sense, thinking about factories, right? So you invest this capital into a factory, right? So got your investment dollars in, you actually have more capital or capacity to produce things, right? And then you have more output. So you have this investment fraction. So whatever was produced, right, a fraction of that you may reinvest, right? And then over time, you have this equipment that you acquired that's beginning to depreciate, right? So your stock is declining as these things are breaking down and falling apart. And so she describes this as the capital lifetime as influencing the depreciation rate, right? So if you have equipment that lasts longer, then the depreciation rate will decline. If you have capital that breaks down quickly or is used up quickly, then the depreciation rate will increase. So this will affect your stock here, right? And so the interesting thing here is that this system behaves just like population because you have one reinforcing loop on the inflow and one balancing loop on the outflow. And so here it is. If a system has the same structure as the population system, it must have the same repertoire of behaviors. All right. And so that's another key takeaway here is that if it may seem strange, so I'm going to read directly from Donella. It may seem strange to you that I call the capital system the same kind of, quote, zoo animal, unquote, as the population system, a production system with factories and shipments and economic flows doesn't look much like a population system with babies being born and people aging and having more babies and dying. But from a systems point of view, these systems, so dissimilar in many ways, have one important thing in common. Their feedback loop structures Both have a stock governed by a reinforcing growth loop and a balancing death loop. Both also have an aging process, still meals, and lathes and turbines get older and die just as people do. So here is the takeaway. Systems with similar feedback structures produce similar dynamic behaviors. And so we're getting to the last example for this week, this fourth of the book. And this is a system with delays. And so this one right here, it was actually, to be honest with you, having a hard time wrapping my mind around, but I get the idea. I think some of the information required a little bit more prying into the numbers to kind of crystallize what was happening here. But in this example here, we have this car lot, right? And they have cars on the lot for sales. You have deliveries coming in, influencing the stock, the inventory levels, and then you have sales outflow of the inventory levels. And so the whole objective here is that you want to keep a certain level of stock on the lot, right? And so you sell a bunch of cars, your inventory goes down, and depending on the rate of sales, right, you may need to increase the number of deliveries. And if you don't have enough sales, then you may want to reduce the amount of deliveries or orders for new cars, right? And so depending on the number of sales, right, you may have these fluctuations, right? And you want to order the right amount of cars. But in this example, there introduces delays. And so maybe it takes 4 days, and I don't remember the exact example here, but maybe it takes 3 days to perceive an increase in sales, right? So now you say, okay, now you say, I need to put an order in for the factory. And then it takes a while to put the order in. And then you may have a delivery delay where it takes a while for the new cars to arrive to the lot. And so now you have this lag time. And as that feedback is working its way back through the system, the inventory is still changing and new feedback is being produced into that system, as you can see here. And so the crazy thing is that if you look at the number of cars on the lot, the stock, the inventory levels over a period of days with those delays, you can see oscillations where the inventory on the lot is going down and spiking upward and down. And it looks like noise in a system. That's exactly what it is, oscillations. But as you can imagine, right, if this amplitude is constantly increasing, what happens when it goes to zero? Is it possible that amplitude can eventually reach zero? So these are the things that I think when you get into deep and look at the math, you can actually see the impact on these systems and whether these systems can actually break down and you can actually go to zero and not be able to sell any cars. Or maybe there's a period where you have all these cars on the lot and you can never get rid of them. All right. So here's another quote. A delay in a balancing feedback loop makes a system likely to oscillate. And so we're going to go and see some more extreme examples here. And the delays can vary at each stage, right? So now you're looking at compound effects and combinatorics of how these delays can impact your business. And so here I'm going to show, this one stood out to me a little bit more because this amplitude it's insane, right? So the response of inventory to the same increase in demand with a shortened reaction time, acting faster makes the oscillations worse, right? So sometimes you can see that we're overcorrecting and undercorrecting. And in this chart here shows what happens when, where this amplitude does go to zero. There's a few days here where they can't do anything. They're just out of business. And so shrinking, or I should say shortening or increasing the delays have a significant impact on the behavior of a system. All right. And I think this says page 55. So we're at a fourth of the book, but that kind of wraps up what we're doing. So take a moment to kind of step back. So in review, I don't know if I should keep going into this level of detail, but I don't know another way to do it. I've seen some book review YouTubes before, and they do a really good job of selling the book. But as far as getting the information of what the book is about, I don't know if I see it. So I want to give some of that, but I don't want to turn these into a classroom unless that's what the audience wants. But here, we take a step back, the introduction. We talked about systems, what they are. the elements, the interconnections, the function and purpose, right? Understanding that there's system and systems, understanding that there's delays and there's times in systems, and that feedback in systems happens over time, and that they can respond to those things. Understanding the structure, the interconnections, the elements, the purpose of that system, the goals, what is it trying to attain, right? The survivability, the self-maintaining, the self-perpetuation, the evolution aspect of systems, right? These things are all important. And so, but yeah, this is, but as far as the business autodidact, what does this bring to the table, right? This gives us an understanding how businesses can operate, how people can operate, and being able to really get a sense of how things can happen in the real world. So that right there sums up this week's episode of Business Autodidact. This was part 1 of 4 of Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. Thank you for spending time with me and self-learning with me. Have a good evening.